If you're okay with Lucas, I'll call you Lucas. Are you okay with that? All right, I've started recording. Here we go.
Well, here we go. How about welcome everybody that has been able to join us, whether in person here or online. This is a wonderful time that we've been able to set aside to offer up and worship and learn. So, and we are so thankful that each of you have been able to join us. But before we go any further, just allow me to open in prayer.
Please.
And I will be happy to introduce our speaker for this evening. Well, let's pray. Father, we are thankful for your presence. Lord, your glory and your presence indeed fill the earth. And Lord, I pray that you would just open our minds and our hearts to be aware of your goodness and your promises. And Lord, I pray as we seek to honor you through the faithful telling of your story, Lord, I pray that you would just draw us into a deeper faith and in a deeper place with your son, Jesus. And we thank you for Professor Jachoski, Lord, that you would continue to lead and bless him and his family. Lord, be with us now. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
And Michael, I'm very conscious. I'm just butchering your last name, but it is Jachoski.
Jachoski. It's okay. I never get offended. Sure. It's fine.
Again, just by way of introduction, if you are unaware of who is on your screen right now, this is Professor Michael Jachoski. He's a humanities professor at SPC here, and I was connected with him through a podcast that he did called Unbelievable, and that's with Pastor Justin. Is he a pastor, or is he just kind of like a?
He's a lay minister. I don't know, actually.
Well, yeah. He's a prominent Christian that kind of facilitates important conversations within the Christian faith, and there just happened to be a conversation on Tolkien and what allegory is and parable and all these different things. And to my surprise, one of the speakers was introduced and said that he's a professor at SBC in Seminole, and I was just blown away that we have such a gift close to us here at church. So I reached out to him via email. Professor Michael just was gracious enough to respond, and we've been able to set up this, and just through conversations that I've had with him over the phone and via email, just kind of caught a vision for what his goal is as being a faithful Christian and kind of telling the Christian story in a faithful way. And tonight was kind of a brainchild of him, and I would like you to introduce yourself to just kind of sure. Maybe how you got to your lot in life, and where did Mythic Mission come from, and so on and so forth. And then you can please feel free to launch into your presentation. But again, just thank you everybody for being here, and just try to keep up. There's going to be a lot of information, a lot of gold nuggets along the way, I'm sure. So just thank you for joining us, and I'll hand it over now.
Thank you, Lucas and Pastor Hillman. You can call me Michael as well. I have no problem with that. It looks like Kathleen has a question or a concern before we go forward. Is there a technical issue, or I don't know? She raised her hand. I don't know if that was intentional.
Sorry. May I interrupt one more time? Sorry. If you have a question, I forgot to address this first. If you have a question through the presentation, if you can't tell, Michael is a professor by trade, and he's opened the floor to questions along the way. So if a question arises as he's giving the presentation, please don't hesitate just to raise your hand. We'll do our best to graciously say, excuse me, and then he can try to address that along the way. So please don't either write it down and ask it another time, or even mid presentation, if I'm correct. Is that all right?
Yeah. Or I'll give my email too. If people want to continue conversation, you can put it in the chat if you have access to Zoom. All of the above are fine. I'm very Wonderful. Relaxed about that. Yeah.
Okay. Now it is all yours.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lucas, so much for the gracious invitation. I'm really excited to be here. If you can't tell, I'm bursting at the seams with excitement for this subject, because I spent years writing a book about this subject. It's something I consume many of my hours of each day talking and thinking about with my students and family, first and foremost, and with God in prayer. I'm happy to be here. I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's a wonderful opportunity for me to share a piece of, well, obviously Jesus with you, but of my heart, my own heart. So thank you. I do have a slide for, introductions and such. I just want to make sure that my PowerPoint is working. There we go. Pastor Hillman made a fantastic flyer that I'm sure you're all familiar with, that we wanted to make sure we gave a shout out here. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here. So thank you for the invitation, for reaching out. It was terrifying to be on Unbelievable because this is a show I've watched over the years. I read his Unbelievable book years ago when I was studying apologetics. And I said, wow, I'm going to be on this show, and I'm going to be with Dr. Holly Ordway, who's going to feature into our conversation prominently tonight, as this is a subject that is her area of expertise. And the terrifying privilege of speaking alongside her, 30 plus years of experience doing this. And, that's basically my age. I'm almost 36. And then Justin Brierley, it was a phenomenal learning experience for me, but terrifying. So I'm much more relaxed at this presentation. Before that one, it was a little tough, but in any event, as Lucas told you, this kind of led to this opportunity here. And as you can see, we have 2 sessions designed for you. Lucas has been, collaborating with me on this and making sure everything is exciting and engaging, but you are going to be challenged. I'm going to make you think. I'm not going easy on you. I'm going to assume that you can handle it and that you want to go deeper into reality, that you want to know Christ better, and you want him to know you better. And so we're going to just, as he prayed, hope that our imaginations, our heart, and our discipleship with Jesus is expanded through these 2 presentations, which I've designed for you. I have designed it from the ground up. And so just to get started with an introduction to our first session here for this evening is Baptizing Our Imaginations. This is one of the first things Lucas sent to me in an email. He said, I'm really interested in this idea, and I concur. I am, and I have been, and I will continue to be fascinated with this line from Surprised by Joy, C.S. Lewis's famous spiritual autobiography. His earlier one, which was done through a mythic sort of lens, was The Pilgrim's Regress, which was done in the 1930s, I think 1933. This one is the real autobiography, and this is where the line comes from, where he speaks of baptizing our imagination. So obviously you're going to get an understanding of what that entails and what that means. Meaning is a very important word for tonight's session, by the way. But we're also going to have a better understanding of a series of vocabulary words and concepts that center around understanding what imaginative apologetics is. And of course, I'm going to define and explain and talk with you about what the imagination is, and of course, what apologetics is, because I assume that not everybody is going to have knowledge of what one or other or multiple of these things are. So I always try to treat my audience like we're building from the ground up. So that's what this first session. The second session is less of me talking, and I'm hoping more of us interacting. Session 2 we'll talk about next week, but it's designed to be about strategies, helpful tips, conversations we can have about how to apply everything we learn in tonight's session, okay? In a second, I'm going to, there it is, introduce myself to you and ways you can communicate with me. I did slightly update the PowerPoint. I wanted to make sure it was as perfect as I could make it. I will send that back to Lucas so that he can disseminate it again, or if you'd like to email me directly, you can do so. And I'd be happy to share, if you haven't done so already, picked up a copy of the worksheet which accompanies these 2 sessions, which is a Microsoft Word document I can send to you, and or the PowerPoint. So don't worry if you miss something. And this slide, you don't have to take any notes. You don't have to take any notes if you don't want to, but I like taking notes. I don't know if anybody else is a highlighter or a note taker, but I would strongly encourage you to do so. If you have a Bible handy, or if you even have an app on your phone with a Bible, that would be also useful for later this evening. Anyway, I will always signify tonight when I think it would be appropriate to take notes. Right now, I'm just talking about myself, and I wanted to have some things on the slide for you. So, hi, my name is Michael Jachoski, and I have been teaching humanities for now 11 years at St. Petersburg College. I was at the Gibbs campus for the last 8 years. I've now moved back to the Clearwater campus, where I started as an adjunct in 2010. Before that, 2008 to 2010, I was in graduate school at USF, and I did 2 years of teaching assistantships where I worked with those gigantic university classes of humanities students, assisting the professors teaching those classes with the big microphones, and I had 2 years of experience with breakout sessions there. So all things considered, about 13 years roughly of experience teaching small, medium, and large groups. My background, I'm a Florida boy. I was born and raised in Titusville. I went to high school in Cocoa Beach. I was a surfer kid. I grew up here in Florida. I have family from New York. Everybody says I have an accent, so maybe I have a bit of a Long Island accent. I don't know. It might come out tonight, but no, I'm from Florida. Graduate degree is in humanities from USF. I have a website where you're going to learn more about my background and expertise if you want. My bachelor degrees, plural, I got 2 from UCF in Orlando. I kind of betrayed my alma mater and became a bull, which my roommates never let me live down. So my wife, Sarah, who's here with us tonight, her brother played football for USF, and I got a lot of you-know-what for showing up at the tailgating and the games for USF for the Bulls. I had UCF roommates that were there when we played each other, and that didn't go over so well. In any event, when you have this PowerPoint, if you'd like to get a breakdown of what I see the humanities is, I've given you a definition of that. I'm not going to go into it tonight. But needless to say, it's a broad discipline of many disciplines where we combine different areas of knowledge. And so I have expertise in several areas, and then in other areas, I'm completely, I'm a blank slate. Music, I played the saxophone for a while, but I'm not a music theorist. So when I teach music to my kids at school, I'm like, guys, this is not my area of expertise. So very broad field. Anyway, you can read more about it on your own. I have extensive living abroad experience. I grew up in the Middle East. My dad and mom moved us to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. It seems I came back to the Middle East as an adult. I'd led 2 study abroad trips to Israel and Palestine, I suppose. That's a story for another time. In 2014, 2016 for SPC. The last trip, my wife and father came with me. We had a blast. I have a Japan trip. In case you're interested, you can apply in 2022, June next year. And well, I've been everywhere in Europe. I haven't been to East Asia, but I've lived around the world and traveled, so I have extensive experience. I'm an author. I'm a podcast creator, as Lucas said. I have a website that you can write it down. It's pretty catchy. www.mythicmission.com is the name of our podcast that Sarah helped me design. In fact, she did all the hard work. She did the graphics, helped me with the name. In fact, I think, Sarah, it was you that came up with the name, if I'm being honest. And she has co-hosted a few, and she's going to be co-hosting a few more with me. I have some new episodes coming out this summer, so check us out on Anchor, iTunes, yada, yada. Website has more information about me if you want to get to know me better. I also have an SPC. You can just Google me website. So y'all can get to know me in a lot of different ways. I'm a public figure now, so just Google me, I guess. I've been teaching and studying and implementing apologetics specifically, even at a church level, Northwood Presbyterian for some years, since 2013. But before that, I was all the way back to 2011 when I started researching my book. I've been really getting into this subject. So about a decade of experience doing this. And I have taught many church classes before, just not with you guys, obviously. But I'm hoping that will change if you like me and you'll have me again. If you'd like to contact me, please see my email here is mjachoski@gmail.com. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, you can see Pastor Hillman. You can also email me directly. My book is The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle Earth. And this is the reason, part of which that Lucas reached out to me. So I'm not here to talk about my book tonight, but what my book is about and what many people's books are about tonight. So on that subject, we'll get to in a minute. I'm going to show you some of my sources in a few minutes, just in case you're wondering. So for that, I have a slide of book covers. It'll be best if you have the PowerPoint at home, and then you can go on Amazon and you can check these books out for yourself. It's a very wildly popular subject, imaginative apologetics. You wouldn't believe how popular it is. I don't think all presentations of it are equal. There are some that are less technical, some that are more. I'm hoping mine will be kind of a blend of the two. In any event, more about me personally. Again, this is a slide you don't have to write, but I have some information here that you might find helpful. There's some beautiful artwork that one of the artists I've credited at the end of the PowerPoint has done from the Lord of the Rings here. So I have a Catholic background for those of you that already are now shifting uncomfortable in your seat, or maybe not. Usually I get mixed responses. So my parents divorced. I found Christ again at 16 through my mom. At the same time, my brother Chris was introducing. I'm the youngest of 5, by the way. It's a complicated story another time. Chris, my older brother, one of my older brothers, introduced me to the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. The movies came out in 2001, right when I hit 16. So we started reading before we saw the movie in December when it came out, and then we just, at least I devoured the rest of Tolkien's Legendarium after that. I didn't see a connection between rediscovering Christ again and discovering Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's books for the first time. I didn't see these two things as interrelated. I tell this story in the preface of my book, in case you're wondering. You can read a sample on Amazon. You can read through the whole preface and find out the story in more detail. For the next 10 years, I went through college and into graduate school and beyond, and I was trying to figure out, like many of you, what it means to be a Christian. One of the things I write about in my book is that, and this may seem odd, but I felt that the world as depicted by Tolkien was more exciting than the one in my Bible. Now, I know that sounds blasphemous at first, but you have to understand I was ignorant of what I worshiped. I didn't understand. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't grasp the significance of Christianity. I knew Christ died for my sins. He rose from the dead. I'm going to be in heaven. I'm going to have a new body one day. I knew all that, but I didn't know what it meant. And this was something that I found that C.S. Lewis himself, among many others, struggled with. So I felt that I belonged there. Now, later, or eerily enough, I found that several other authors have written about this. It's not just me. There were many people who feel the same way. One book by Phil Ryken, who I think teaches out at Wheaton College in Illinois, has written a book called The Messiah Comes to Middle Earth, which is similar to mine. It was a great inspiration. He has a guy, a professor, I don't know, male or female, in one of the chapters of his book, explain the same exact experience. And I didn't feel so bad after I read that, and I was easier on myself. In 2011, I read Simply Jesus by N.T. Wright. Some of you may be familiar with his works. He's not a perfect scholar. We have disagreements. I don't agree with everything he teaches either. And I realized this way of phrasing what the gospel was about, how God became king. It sounded kind of weird at first. Like, I'm American. And he writes this in his book. Americans, we got rid of a monarchy in the 18th century. We fought a revolution to get rid of that. So this didn't really make much sense. But then I realized it reminded me of a story I'd heard before in The Lord of the Rings. And I'm like, I started making connections and started, well, that scene in the book, and it just all made sense. And I thought, wow, this was a baptism of my imagination. And it kind of reverse order. It put that last decade of my life in a meaningful order, and it had significance. And finally, everything kind of clicked. And the missing piece, which was I didn't understand what all this was meaning, finally slid into place. And I'm going to quote Lewis here, who said, what had been holding me back, he writes in a letter to Arthur Greaves, one of his buddies, right after he converted, or right about the time he converted, rather, to Christianity from atheism. He says, what had been holding me back is not so much a difficulty in believing as a difficulty in knowing what the doctrine or doctrines of Christianity meant. You can't believe a thing while you are ignorant of what the thing is. This resonated with me on an intense level, as I'm sure it will resonate with some of you. And so there's my story. Here is a list of, you're like, oh, great, this class is hard enough. Here's 25 books. My own is included in here, over here in the corner, but there are some just fantastic books here. If you'd like to know more about what I think you should read first, if you are more of a technical, rational person, just reach out via email. If you're more of a, concrete, imaginative person, or you're a little bit of both, which is really what you should be, or, you just like the, get down to brass tacks, just email me and say, okay, which of these, aside from your own book, should I get into first? I would not recommend my own book first, although I hope you will read it, but it helps to have some other background knowledge. In any event, these are my sources. I've worked very hard to put this lecture together for you. I'm hoping it will be interactive as well. I'm going to go now into the lecture proper. and literally going to throw you into things with a German word that really means that very thing. Geworfenheit means thrown into-ness of life. Aren't we all kind of here in the same boat? We are all thrown into life. Nobody handed us a manual. Nobody told us how to live. Nobody told us how to make sense of things. We don't know the kind of family we're going to have, the kind of friends we're going to have. How do we make sense of life? How do we put it all together? As we're going to find tonight, the imagination has a critical role in answering this question. How do we make sense of life? A critical role, not just it's a piece or an appendage like the appendix in our bodies that we cut out. That's how the imagination has been regarded, as something that is, sublimated to reason. It's secondary to reason and proposition. Or useless to some people. Or we tell our kids, grow up. And I know I've done it, and it's wrong. C.S. Lewis has a great quote. He said, a kind of paraphrasing St. Paul from 1 Corinthians, if I'm not mistaken, he says, when I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of being childish. You don't have to grow up. We need the imagination. So stop trying to cut it out of your life. So we're going to find this is crucial for this evening. But here's a good German word, Geworfenheit, Gesundheit, excuse you. Yes, it's a good word. It's also kind of a double entendre because I'm throwing you into a subject that I don't know, have no idea about. So forgive me as I'm about to throw you into a subject that is maybe overwhelming for you at first, but that's the process of education. As you know, sitting in church, you're there hopefully to be challenged, to change your life, to change the way you live. Jesus's parables confront us, and they're not supposed to make us feel warm and fuzzy and cozy inside. They're supposed to say, get up, get off your butt, get up and walk, do something with your life, serve me, and pay attention to me, right? So we need to take that tone tonight. I'm going to try to do that. Okay, so the worksheet that accompanies the next 2 weeks, I had to move number 4 to the next session, as you'll see that there's a lot to cover. And here's the thing, I may not stay long on some of these slides, and a lot of these notes are things you can take on your own, and I would much rather me just kind of talk about what I need to talk about and then move on. So here, if there's one real bullet point I'd like you to kind of just get cemented to get started is, well, let's begin somewhere. We need to begin somewhere. Well begun is halfway done. What I'd like to start with is to start with us. What do people care about? Okay, and one of the things that I want to leave you with, and here's already a practical tip for doing imaginative apologetics, which is kind of redundant because all of apologetics should be imaginative, you'll find out. But here's a tip. Start with where people are. This is what Paul does in Acts 17, as we'll get to later. It's what Jesus did. It's what we should do. I can't remember exactly which letter of Paul's he says, I need to be all things to all people. He's not talking about being a chameleon. He's talking about adjusting the same objective, permanent truth to fit varying circumstances, which is a very different thing from changing the standard to meet the changing circumstances. You don't want to change the standard, but you've got to find a way to deliver the message to people in varying different contexts. But there's a sure thing when we start here, because I think the 3 things, and scholars like Paul Gould, who I'm borrowing this from, and many others who have talked about this, the 3 things that all people care about are what Plato called the 3 transcendentals, the 3 things that are beyond opinion, okay, is what he meant by that. And what are those 3 things? Well, they're right in front of you. Truth, goodness, and beauty. These have to be, I think, our starting points from within culture. Sports, science, every discipline, every hobby, every vocation, everything that matters, the arts falls into one of these 3 things. Why do people love sports? Well, God, we could sit here all day and talk about that. And there'll be better equipped to talk about that. But there's something beautiful, there's something good, there's something true. Maybe it speaks to a lifestyle that was robbed from us, or that we don't have the skill to participate in, but it answers something in us. These have to be our starting points. So if you are taking notes, this would be a good thing to write down. Truth, goodness, beauty. These are the 3 things from within culture. Every human being cares about these things, even if they don't see them expressed ultimately in Jesus Christ. These are the 3 things that people care about. how do we connect those longings that people have to the gospel and to Jesus? Paul Gould says we use three guides, and you can write this down too. Reason, which corresponds with truth, as you'll see later. Conscience, which corresponds with goodness. And imagination, which corresponds with beauty. We're trying to build from the longings that people have as Christians, we want to connect people to Jesus, who is truth, goodness, and beauty in a person. God is love, God is truth, God is goodness, God is beauty. How do we appeal to people? What are the tools that we use to appeal to people's longings for truth, goodness, and beauty, to get them to look not at us, but to Jesus? Reason, conscience, imagination. Obviously, this evening and next week, I'm primarily interested in reason and imagination, especially that last one. But we'll talk about ethics, I'm sure, too. It'll come up when I quote The Lord of the Rings later, and I'm going to give you an example of how imaginative apologetics works in literature. But those are the two that really matter, I think, for now. This you don't have to write. This you don't have to write. I'm just talking here, so just take a break and listen. And if you guys have any questions, I'm looking. Let me know. The rest of the stuff, I really don't think you need to write at all. So just enjoy. Some notes for myself. I would just summarize thusly. I would say this: we as Christians always feel, I know I do, I'm speaking for myself, I can only speak for myself with certainty, I got to get Jesus into this conversation. I have this student who's really seeking. I know I've been where he or she is. I've got to mention this. Oh, don't forget that. Oh, you forgot that. Oh man, you should have said that. There's so much pressure, and you should feel pressure. The gospel is urgent. I'm not going to deny that, but maybe that's not the way that Jesus approached things. Now, yes, Jesus was direct, but 1/3 of the gospels are parables. That is not direct communication. It's indirect communication. We're going to talk about the significance of that later. Greg Cochle, famous apologist from Stand to Reason organization, who founded that organization, he says, we should be trying to put a rock in people's shoes. We don't need to get them to seal the deal. Maybe you don't like Scott McKnight. I know a lot of people are critical of some of his ideas with the whole woke thing now. There's all sorts of talk about certain scholars, but one thing that always stuck with me, he said, is that we need to be in the business of making disciples, not converts. Sometimes, like in my own story, conversion happens over a long period of time. It happens in fits and starts and in increments. Don't get somebody to seal the deal, to put a proverbial gun to somebody's head and say, well, do you believe in Jesus? Do you? May not be what they need, but they do need Jesus. So how do you get from point A to point B? I hear you. I feel your pain. I know you want to get there, but that may not be the best way to approach it. And if we're trying to imitate Christ, and let's face it, who among us are not, maybe that's not the way he modeled it. So we've got to take a look at that. I like this. You don't have to write it down, but to put a rock in someone's shoe, you know how that is. It's annoying as all get up. You're running, I run. It's the worst thing in the world. You've got a rock in your shoe, get it out. But think about what it does is it reminds you that it's there. It annoys you, it pesters you, it persists and presses itself upon you to say, pay attention to me. What is something that you can do to put a rock in somebody's shoe? That is a great tip, I think. Okay. Moving on here, I'd like to talk about the problems that stand in our way. Here's a beautiful work of art of Lothlorien from The Lord of the Rings by the Hildebrandt brothers. This is popular in the 70s. Anyway, it's great picture if you want to visualize what's going on in Tolkien's universe. But here I'm actually going to be talking and drawing on C.S. Lewis. And I got to get my Kindle because I want to read something to y'all that I need to read in full to kind of have you understand Lewis's thinking here. Many of you are probably familiar with C.S. Lewis, who was a friend of Tolkien's. It was Tolkien who actually got Lewis to come to the faith, for those of you that are wondering. And I'll allude to that later. For something that I want you to take notes on, I would like you to identify what, and I'm going to, of course, explain this, what is our tragic dilemma? Now, where can you find this information? There is a collection of essays by C.S. Lewis called God in the Dock. And there's an essay that's very catchy, Myth Became Fact by C.S. Lewis. In that very short essay, toward the end of it, there is a very just tremendously influential passage that will get you thinking for years, probably. We're not going to be able to plumb its depths tonight, but I'm going to read it to you, and I'm going to identify what is this tragic dilemma. And so what I want you to walk away from with this slide before I move on to the next information, and if you have the worksheet, this kind of roughly corresponds with number 3, is what is the tragic dilemma according to Lewis? Now, obviously, as Christians, we want to say sin. Sin is a multifaceted concept. This fits into that, okay? Just FYI, it fits, of course, into that. Our tragic dilemma is also just kind of the pain of being human. There's this, as you're going to find, there's this situation we find ourselves in that really kind of sucks. we want to not be in this situation, but we are, and that's what a dilemma is, right? We can't get out of it, or can we? And is it up to us? Maybe it's not up to us. Maybe it's up to God. Okay. So for those of you looking for the answer, this is the answer to the question, number 3. What is our tragic dilemma? I'm going to read this quote, and then I'm going to read the entire passage, which shouldn't take too long, but I do want to linger on it for a moment. But Lewis says this is our dilemma: either to taste and not to know, or to know and not to taste. So let's get a little bit of a better idea of what he's talking about here and why this matters. This is, again, this is our obstacle. We talked about how we can connect with people a moment ago. What is in the way? Well, there's a lot of things in the way, but this is a big problem. To explain this, he says, we must look a little closer at myth in general. And yes, we'll define that term later. Human intellect is incurably abstract. Pure mathematics is the type of successful thought. Yet the only realities we experience are concrete. This pain, this pleasure, this dog, this man. While we are loving the man, bearing the pain, enjoying the pleasure, we are not intellectually apprehending pleasure, pain, or personality. When we begin to do so, on the other hand, the concrete realities sink to the level of mere instances or examples. We're no longer dealing with them, but with that which they exemplify. So this is our dilemma: either to taste something and not to know it, or to know it and not to taste it. Or more strictly, to lack one kind of knowledge because we are in an experience, or to lack another kind because we are outside it. Now, let me pause. I bet you're wondering, I need something to imagine here. I know you're wondering this because you might be having a hard time following him. Well, imagine somebody you love, or somebody that you know in your life, better yet, or maybe not better yet, but another example that's really funny. When you're laughing so that you have a stitch in your side and your face is so red and you're crying, are you, what is humor? Are you thinking about humor in that moment? Are you thinking about what made the joke funny? Or are you just laughing because you're experiencing the humor? Well, that's probably the right answer. You need to imagine right now, I think, this example of you laughing so hard at something that all you can do is experience funny and humor. But the moment you stop laughing and you go, oh my God, what made that so funny? You're no longer experiencing humor, you're thinking about it. And here's what Lewis says. He says, this is kind of profound. Let's face it, everything he said was profound. As thinkers, we are cut off from what we think about. As tasting, touching, willing, loving, hating, we do not clearly understand. This is powerful. The more lucidly we think, the more we are cut off. The more deeply we enter into reality, the less we can think. And then he goes on with those examples of pleasure and humor. If only my toothache would stop, I could write another chapter about pain. But once it stops, what do I really know about pain? Of this tragic dilemma, here's the solution. Here's what Lewis says. Are you paying attention? Okay, so what's the answer? Dilemma usually has a way out, we hope. Or maybe it doesn't, but he proposes that there is. Here's what he says. Of this tragic dilemma, myth is the partial solution. In the enjoyment of a great myth, we come nearest to experiencing as a concrete what can otherwise be understood only as an abstraction. Something about myth gives us that unified experience that we can think and experience at the same time. There's something powerful about a well-told story. I bet many of you know this story of Winnie the Pooh. You don't have to write this. One of the many stories of Winnie the Pooh and Rabbit. Pooh goes into Rabbit's hole. He squeezes into his home. He offers him honey. He can't stop eating it, and he eats all of Rabbit's stores. You chuckle to yourself, this is a cute kid's story. You're not thinking about what the story is about, are you? When somebody's telling you a good story, sit down, stay a while, let me tell you a story. You're there in, rapt listening, and when it's over, you're like, oh man, that was a great story. It's not always the best thing to say, well, what did you think that meant? Sometimes the story is still pressing itself on your mind so powerfully, you don't know how to answer. But what you're experiencing there is the partial solution. Lewis later says that the Incarnation was the solution. Jesus, God become man. But myth is a partial solution to this tragic dilemma. So I don't know if you prepared to hear that this evening, because myth, usually we think useless, false, waste of time, but we're going to get to that in due time. Anyway, Lewis, he admits he makes heavy weather of this subject. He did. He didn't always express this in ways that people can understand, but for those of us who spend enough time thinking about this, it starts to make sense. And you might have to do that the next few weeks, as you think about this. All right, so all of this is just review. I've said all this already. I've just kind of interpreted everything. And in case you missed it, something else you might want to write is that the solution, the partial solution to the tragic dilemma, is a good myth. See, a good story, it delivers that knowledge about something that you want, but it gives you an experience at the same time. You are able to taste and know at the same time. And that's a very powerful experience. But notice when you go to talk about your favorite story, what happens? The dilemma. You think about it and you're like, oh man, what is the Lord of the Rings about? Well, it's about this, it's about that. Now you're not in the story, you're extracting, like systematic theologians do in the Bible, right? You're extracting theology from the text, which is not always the best thing to do, but that's another story, another topic for another time. But if you leave it in the form that the Bible gives us, or the Lord of the Rings, as a story, and most of the Bible is story and poetry, then you get that partial solution. I think that's very, very popular, very important, and I think it's a popular answer given that people are writing about this today. So from here, we need to do ourselves a favor and ask a question. So given how we should start with people, truth, goodness, and beauty, given that reason, conscience, and imagination are ways in which we can reach people, given that we have this huge obstacle in communication with people, we're cut off from what we think about, what can we do to reach people? It seems hopeless. After all, this dilemma, not all of us are gifted storytellers, myself included. I'm not the best storyteller in the world. I couldn't write fiction, okay? But some of us are really good at it. But we're all called as apologists to try to be. So how can you fulfill the Great Commission? What can we do to do a better job? Paul Gould says, like many others have also pointed out, that we need to understand our Athens. Now, many of you probably already know, I've skipped over number 4 because remember, number 4 is moved to session 2. So we went from 3 to 5. Athens is in Greece. It's a famous capital with all the great Greek architecture. It's not the only place. The Parthenon is there. And of course, everybody loves the Parthenon. It's a great example of classical architecture. We could talk about it for the rest of the hour. It's a wonderful work of architecture from the 5th century. But what Paul Gould means by this is we need to understand our Athens today. Athens in Paul's day, which he's alluding to Acts 17, was filled with Epicureans and Stoics and pagans of all different stripes and types. What is our Athens like? And I'm going to just highlight one particular point, and we're still talking about problems here. We're up against a lot of opposition. Some of you probably already realize that post-COVID, we have the question of critical race theory and all critical theory, post-colonial theory. We're being asked to look at our syllabi, and there's all sorts of oppositions. Of course, this is not, I'm not pretending that this is it, but this is a problem. And what is a problem? Well, then and now, we are disenchanted. And I would just like to focus on this one tonight, because I want to move on. I want to make sure that we can get through what I have planned and leave time for questions, although you can interrupt at any time. And I'm trying to make sure that I take breaks to look. What does it mean to be disenchanted? We're going to go into in the next slide just a little bit. And I have this wonderful essay that I've shared with you on the worksheet with a link. You can go read this essay by C.S. Lewis. called Talking About Bicycles, where he talks about disenchantment and reenchantment a little bit more. But we'll get into that in a moment. So let's just identify a further problem. Another problem, aside from the tragic dilemma, is that, at least with my students, we're dealing with a lot of shoulder shrugs. I don't care. I don't care. Christianity isn't relevant. It's boring. Religion is boring. Who wants to talk about religion? Who wants to talk about Greek mythology? Oh my God, we got to talk about architecture for 2 weeks. Oh, Lord help me. That's part of it. But we also just lack sacred space. Think about what it was like back in Jesus's day, as Jesus walked into the temple court. And I've been there, I've stood there where the steps lead up to where the temple court was, where he flipped over the moneylenders' tables and, quoted the prophet Jeremiah. There is just this very powerful disenchantment of people who don't have a concept of sacred space. But back then, as a Second Temple Jew, somebody living in that time period, which historians call Second Temple Judaism, the 6th century BC to about the time of Christ, a little bit after, to be in the presence of the temple, not this temple, not Athens, but the Temple of Solomon that was rebuilt by the Persians and later by King Herod, was to be in the presence of God, right? To go into the Holy of Holies, which was the high priest job. We have nothing like this in American culture that I can really think of. We also just don't take religion seriously enough. It's a private subject. Nobody talks about it except on Sundays or Wednesdays or Saturdays if you have Bible classes. But that's another topic called the sacred secular split for another time, where we pigeonhole religion. Well, science can tell us about the world, but religion can't. That's part of what I mean by disenchantment. We don't take religion seriously. That's unprecedented in human history, folks. For most of human history, we have taken religion very seriously. In fact, primarily, science has grown out of the religious impulse. We went looking for scientific and naturalistic meaning in the universe because we expected to find it there. There are loaded philosophical assumptions in doing science. Let no one tell you differently. Any philosopher today worth his or her salt will tell you that. Einstein is well quoted, that the one thing about the universe that's incomprehensible is that it's comprehensible. But we don't look at the world that way anymore. We're just kind of, not everybody, it's hard to generalize, but we're under this enchantment of disenchantment, the spell of ennui in French, right? It's this profound boredom, scratching our chin. We're just bored by religion. We're bored by Christianity in particular. A lot of people already, don't tell me, Jesus died for my sins. I know this story. We're going to get to that. And a lot of us are under the spell of materialism. This world is all there is. Many Christians I know believe that, which is just inexcusable in my opinion. It's just inexcusable. No, this world is not all there is. How would you know it's all there is unless you knew that it wasn't? A little bit of logic goes a long way. So we've got all sorts of problems here. Let's talk a little bit more about disenchantment. There is more to this. I want to just hop over here to another slide, if you'll forgive me. More of a definition here. Here you go. If you'd like to write it down, again, you know how it is. As I've said, you're welcome to. What does it mean to disenchant the world? Well, our obsession with, well, what does science say? What is science? First of all, this drives me nuts. I have students all the time who come into my class and say, well, science says. I go, hold on a second. You mean scientists say, right? Because science doesn't speak. Scientists say this, that, and the other thing. Okay, now I can follow you. Science doesn't say anything. Who's doing science? Scientists are doing science. Do they have any worldviews? Do they look at the world from a particular perspective? You bet they do. It's not just scientists, though. All sorts of people have this predicament. Not only the tragic dilemma, but we have this tendency to view the world as the flatlands, as one author that I've just read a book from calls it. We live in a two-dimensional world. There's no vertical element. There's no third dimension. We've reduced the world to what the five senses can show us, and that's it. We've restricted truth to human reason, science, what scientists say and the scientific methods that they use, and that's it. If I can't pass through those lenses, then it doesn't mean anything. And this empties the world of all excitement, in my opinion. So if you look at these pictures that I have, we've got Switzerland, where I've spent some time and I wish I could live there. It's beautiful. Trying to think, who was it? Francis Schaeffer had a famous apologist, Labrie, the apologetics sort of mansion in Switzerland, where he helped people like Nancy Pearcey, if you've heard of her, find Christ. And there's still people who run this today there in Switzerland. Anyway, that's a place that seems enchanted. You look at your local factory and you think, okay, I see the juxtaposition. I'm not saying we don't need factories. I'm just saying that we look at the world kind of through this image, is that it's just flattened, it's mechanistic, it's boring. This is what Tolkien was so afraid of happening, is that the world would just be reduced to machines and to social media, etc. So disenchantment. Okay, for homework for session 2, I've assigned, and you'll read this essay called, if you care to, Talking About Bicycles by C.S. Lewis. And I'm not going to go in depth here, but he talks about what it's like to learn to ride a bike. As a kid, first growing up, you're young, like my daughter's 4. She's still trying to learn how to ride a bike. But I remember when she first laid eyes on it, just like our son Lucas, who's 7, it's like, what is this thing? I don't know. What does it do? What does it mean? It's unenchanted, right? You don't know what it's for. You just know it's this thing with some circular objects and some whatever. Then you learn to ride the bike and you can't stop riding it. Now they're into scooters right now, so they're in the enchanted age. But I know one day time's going to come when they're bored. You guys want to go for a scooter ride? No, we don't want to do that. Well, that's the disenchanted age. Now, whether we're talking about scooters or bicycles, and that's not what we're really talking about. This is a story that you're imagining, that being enchanted and disenchanted is like riding a bicycle or learning to ride it and then getting bored with it. And then looking at it, gathering dust in your garage, and then thinking, man, I used to remember when I was 7, I used to love that thing. I'm going to ride that again. I'm going to get a new bike. And that's the re-enchanted age. And so it's a really powerful essay. I hope you'll read it. And anyway, we all go through these stages. One thing that you can do is identify the person to whom you're speaking or speaking with. Where are they on the stage sort of, overview? Are they in the unenchanted age? Probably not, but you'd have to be pretty sheltered. The enchanted, are they in 2, 3, or 4? And this can help a great deal, FYI, if you're looking to reach somebody with the gospel. It can be very, very helpful. All right, so moving on from there, I have some quotes. I'm going to hop over some quotes for now, just in the interest of time. But there is one quote we cannot skip because it's the subject of today's main sort of theme behind session 1, and that is, finally, we're getting to the imagination stuff. We've identified the starting point. We've identified a series of obstacles. We now need to move into methodology. How can we do, what is apologetics? How can we do imaginative apologetics? What does it mean to have our imaginations baptized? Okay, you remember the story I told you, my story. I was reading The Lord of the Rings. I rediscovered Christ after family divorce. I was a Catholic. Okay, 10 years of seeking and learning what it meant to be a Christian. I read N.T. Wright's book. I looked back on those 10 years and I thought, man, this reminds me, the way he talks about the gospel, it reminds me of a story I've heard before. It was The Lord of the Rings, but really what it was is The Lord of the Rings was reminding me of the true gospel. See, here's what had been happening, folks. I was tasting and experiencing and grasping the significance, the meaning imaginatively of the Christian worldview through the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien without even knowing it. And all the while I was trying to figure out what it meant to be a Christian. And then those two things merged and it all kind of clicked. And I realized, okay, wait, the urgent, imaginatively vibrant life that I wanted the gospel to have, that I found in Middle Earth, I hope you're following this, is really the life that the Bible describes that it's not the one that I can have, it's the one that I do have. And God has called me. And it all just clicked for me. And I said, wow, okay, that story is an experience of baptizing the imagination. Where does this quote come from? What is this idea? So your pastor, reached out to me and said, this is something that fascinated him. Well, yeah, me too. C.S. Lewis, looking back, like many of us find, hindsight is 2020. We look back and it all makes sense. Speaking early in his life, after his experience in World War I, alongside Tolkien, although not physically alongside, they didn't know each other until the 1920s and then the 30s. anyway, when he discovered George MacDonald early reading Fantaste, I think he found it at a train stop. There was a bookstore, and he describes himself later in life as that was the moment my imagination was baptized. So here's what he says later in Surprised by Joy. He says, in the depth of my disgraces, in the then invincible ignorance of my intellect, all this was given me without my asking. He's talking about his conversion, even without consent. That night, my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized. The rest of me, not unnaturally, took longer. Well, join the club. That is usually the way it happens. Even if you don't know that that's what's happening, that's what's happening. I didn't know that this was happening. It took me many years to read books and talk to people and listen to people. And then, as I've told you my story, to look back and kind of say, well, this led to this. I didn't know this was connected. And that's how life is. Geworfenheit, right? We're thrown into it, and then we're turned around, like hit the pinata. We're spun around, the blindfolds on, and it's like, okay, where do we hit? I don't know what to do. And anyway, eventually, I'm so glad I found an explanation. I'm not alone. Many of us feel alone. And I finally felt in understanding this that I wasn't. So for your imagination to be baptized, it gives us a sense that their imagination is something in our mind. It's something that is at the forefront of the experience of being human. So we need to get into that. And I think you know what he means by baptized. It was kind of initiated, right? Because baptism is an initiation. It's also a sign, an outward sign of an inward decision to come to faith, that we've accepted Jesus Christ. It may, I know there's disagreement about preceding faith or coming after faith, but anyway, we all know what baptism is. So we'll get into this, but here's one famous apologist I'm going to be interviewing on the podcast in August, and he has written a book all about this called Reimagining Apologetics. Here's what he says. Apologetics may be less a matter of addressing intellects and more a matter of baptizing imaginations. That's saying a lot. If he's saying it, we all need to be listening. This is a respected Christian in the church community. Wow. Now, he's not saying intellects don't matter. We're going to get to this. So some of you might be having this objection. It's an either or thing. It's not. It's just that we've neglected the imagination so long, and there are certain historical forces that have led to that, which again is not something I plan to go into this evening. I didn't want to give you a history lesson. But there's reasons for why, why is it that we've neglected the imagination in public schools? Why is it that a lot of us try to send our kids to our school at our church or private schools where they'll get this? Well, because the transcendence is being emptied out of the world, and we've privileged reason, not myth, and not imagination. Why is that? Well, there's all sorts of books and people who will tell you why that is. I'm not going to be doing that tonight. So let's get into some definitions now. And of course, we're nearing the end of my talking portion, which I'd hope to be kind of done sooner. But I hope you guys are getting a lot out of this, and that I'm speaking as clearly as I can to make sense of all this, and as casually as I can. We have a couple of other concepts to kind of hurdle over, but I think you're going to easily grasp the concepts. Well, let's start simple. This is one of my favorite works of art, by the way, again, by the Hildebrandt brothers. They did some Tolkien calendars, 70s and 80s, I think earlier than that, even maybe the 60s. And this is one from The Hobbit, and it's a scene from chapter 1 of The Hobbit. We'll talk about later, but it's a great scene if you've ever read the book, when Bilbo is being kind of initiated into the company of the dwarves, and he's being tasked as the burglar to go and steal the Arkenstone out from Smaug's watchful gaze. And so if you don't know The Hobbit, you got to read it, but some of you probably do. So moving on, apologetics. What is it? Apologia is a Greek word meaning to give usually what is called a rational defense for the Christian faith. So for those of you that don't know, it's a term that does pop up a couple times in the Bible. 1 Peter 3:15 and 16, I think, and there's some other verses you should look at there. Talks about always being ready to give an answer with gentleness and respect. That's the famous apologist sort of creed, if you will. There are other passages that aren't coming off the top of my head here, but apologia, to put yourself in front of the logos, is really what it means, to put yourself in front of Christ, to defend Christ, to negatively or positively. So it can be negatively to, dissuade people from misconceptions about the Christian faith. Positively, it can be to build a case for the Christian faith. Here's why the resurrection is historical. Here's why Jesus really rose from the dead, that it's not just a myth, but it's the myth made fact. It's really real, so on and so forth. That's what apologetics is. It's a discipline in the church. It always has been. And yet some churches don't emphasize it, which is baffling to me. But then there is where I've found we can overdose on apologetics, especially because apologetics is usually defined as rational defense. We need to give arguments. Now, I don't want to diss William Lane Craig. How could I ever? He's one of the greatest Christian thinkers out there. However, he is rational apologist extraordinaire. I started off reading his works, and that's why I know so much, but it sometimes is too much. It's just piling on rational proposition after rational proposition, argument after argument, modus tollens, modus ponens, A, if A, then B, logic, argumentation, and it's like, oh, syllogisms, Aristotle, not my idea of fun all the time. It's too much. People don't always trade in arguments. They don't always trade in syllogisms. We don't think syllogistically. We think in what scholars call enthymemes and partial syllogisms. We don't think that way. So why would we expect people to come to faith that way? Some people do, but very few, which is where the imagination comes into play. All right, so if we get through anything tonight, it is to get through this. And I am fine, absolutely fine doing some things next week to kind of catch up if I'm going too slow. I want to make sure we leave time for questions and deep breaths and exchange. So there's a couple other slides I'd like to try to get through, so let me try to do that. But imagination, this is very important, so let's go through this carefully. What is it? We've been taught that the imagination is something that should be in the trash pile. We think, go use your imagination, kids. It's like a dismissive thing. Just go make some stuff up, who cares? That only captures a very small piece of what the imagination is. If you please, let's go through a more detailed breakdown. Imagination is what C.S. Lewis called the organ of meaning. Now, in order to grasp the meaning of that sentence, you need to use your imagination. Now, don't think of a musical organ. Think of an organ anatomically in your body. What he's almost kind of insinuating is, imagine that the imagination is an organ that does what? Well, your pancreas does this, your kidneys do this, your heart does that. What does the imagination do? You see, in order to grasp what the imagination is, you have to use your imagination, which is pretty cool. He's using an image, an organ, to capture your mind and go, imagine, if you will, the imagination is this. And what is its function? Well, your kidneys do this. What does the imagination do? It does this job. It is the organ of meaning, which means its job is to generate significance. In order for something, or before something can be true or false, it has to mean first. Something that's nonsense can't be either true or false. It's just nonsense. But if something has meaning, if it has an aboutness about it, if you get what I'm saying, if it's got directed purpose and significance, this is what we say meaning is, it has the potential to be true or false. Okay, I'm going to give you some imaginative scenarios here to imagine what the imagination is further in a moment. What else does the imagination do, and what is it? It's a faculty of our mind, that's ability of our mind to picture things that are not always immediately present. It's concerned with possibility. Think, for example, of the letter that C.S. Lewis wrote, a young girl who wrote about Aslan, about the Chronicles of Narnia. And he responds and he says, if you will, my works are not allegory. Imagine them as supposals. He described his works as supposals. Suppose, if you will, or we might use the modern word, imagine, if you will, for a moment, that the immaterial deity became a lion called Aslan, which is a Turkish word for lion, by the way. What would the gospel look like if this happened? I propose to you, imagine that for a moment. And then imagine if, and then you go read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you get the picture, don't you? Now, hold on. You see what I just did there? Do you get the picture? That is inviting you to use your imagination. To understand the meaning of that sentence, you have to use your imagination. Do you get the picture that I'm trying to propose to you? So this is what I mean by concerned with possibility. Think of Jesus's parables. We're going to dive deep into those in session 2. What if the kingdom of God was like this, a mustard seed, or a woman who lost a coin, or a lost sheep, or a father, unnamed father who had two sons. Well, there are lots of fathers with two sons in the Bible. You think Isaac with Jacob and Esau, right? And you think of Jacob with all his sons. You think of Abraham with Isaac and Ishmael, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you guys get the picture again. There we go. Here's another image, okay? Michael Ward, a very famous imaginative scholar who has written about this, he says, imagine that we have a house. The basement of the house is the sense data, if you will. Our senses, our five senses takes in all this data and feeds it to what? The first line of defense is our imagination. Our imagination takes the raw sense data. Imagine you see someone in the crowd at a concert you think is your friend. You go, oh, that's Mike. Okay, hey, Mike, hey, turn around. Your senses say that's Mike. Your imagination, as he turns around, you're trying to make sense of that data, but it's not Mike. So our senses can trick us. They're not infallible, but your imagination compiles a picture of Mike. It pictures something that's not immediately present and forms a composite picture. And you guys get what I'm saying, I think. Okay, so imagine this house. You have the basement floor. The data comes in. The imagination takes the data, the raw materials, if you will, and it hands it up to the second story. What's the second story? This is reason. The reason is the faculty of our mind that is the organ of truth. Its job, and now these are not separate things. They're two things that work together in our mind that are inseparable. Reason's job is to take the meaning from the data that the imagination gives to reason. And reason says, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's true. And it confirms it. And so now we know it's a fact. And so reason and imagination work in tandem together to come to the conclusion that something is true or false. But in order for something to be true or false, it first has to mean. If I said, as one Christian scholar has given this silly example, green dreams sleep furiously, it's a meaningless statement. It's absolute nonsense. Imagine a square circle. Imagine a married bachelor. I can't. That's just a contradiction. It's nonsense. There's nothing I can do with that. It doesn't mean anything. It can't be true or false. It's not a matter of true or false. It's just a matter of, this is nonsense, but God is three persons in one. That's not nonsense. That has the potential to be true. It's meaningful. Now that's a statement I can work with. You shouldn't kill people, or you shouldn't murder. Let's say the other subject is another ethical dilemma, but there you have it. Okay, so that's how imagination and reason work together. So if you haven't already gotten the picture, reason depends on imagination. Imagination depends on reason. In order for something to be true or false, it has to mean first. Imagination images things. It's the ability to picture things. At the very least, that's what you should take away. So think about the consequences for our doing apologetics. How can you reach people by accessing their imagination? Start thinking about this for session 2. There are lots of things we can do. And in the next slide, I'm going to give you a summary of what imaginative apologetics is. And then I'll have to see what I have with a few minutes left to me before we just kind of turn it over for questions or what have you. Okay. So just, if you will, this first bullet point, so that we have a nice tight summary from Dr. Holly Ordway. What is imaginative apologetics? This is what you came here tonight to hear. As we're setting ourselves up for the second session, now we know what it is and what the obstacles are and where we should start. Now we know what it is. How should we go about doing it? When should I do this rather than argue with somebody and try to give them proofs for the resurrection? There's all sorts of books out there that do that. When would it be a better time for me to tell them a story or to use an image, or like C.S. Lewis did in his letter to that young girl, to say, suppose, a man went off into a faraway country, and there's the beginning of a great story, and then that story ultimately means and is about the gospel. Imagine pointing to a Gothic cathedral and saying, okay, look, Christianity is like this Gothic cathedral. It's got these soaring pointed arches that go 120 feet in the air. Imagine that this is capturing the essence of the transcendence of the gospel, that God is so infinitely greater than we are. But then look at all the foliage on the external parts of the Gothic cathedral, that the trees and the little shrubs that are there, it's meant to evoke the Garden of Eden. It's very down to earth. Look at all the stained glass windows and all the panels talking about the Bible. It's very earthy. That's the idea that the Holy Spirit is present in creation, that God has always been part of his creation while still being independent of it. You see how I just used a work of architecture to illustrate what two very hard theological concepts of talking about God in Christianity are about. God is the author outside of his story, but he's also written himself into the story. You see what I did there too? I use an image of a writer and a book and a story to tell a story about Christianity, and now you understand what I mean. It's not nonsense, it's significant, and you're starting to work. And this is what it means to do imaginative apologetics. It means to be careful about the jargon that we use. Christ died on the cross. Well, C.S. Lewis really struggled with this. What did somebody's death 2,000 years ago in a corner of the Empire of Rome, Roman Empire, mean to me today? You can tell me all the day long that Jesus died for me, but what does that mean? What is the significance of that? I don't grasp it. How can we tell a better story? Well, Lewis wrote 7 books called the Chronicles of Narnia to make that point. And he also wrote a few others, I'm told. So imaginative apologetics is the approach to apologetics in evangelization. There's a word we're all familiar with that brings the imagination into our work, sometimes through the arts, but also through just paying attention to how language is used. So instead of dropping a bunch of doctrines and the Apostles' Creed and or the Nicene Creed, or talking about systematic theology with your seekers in your church, how can we invite them into a better story? And what I'm going to be doing, obviously, into next week's session is we're going to be pointing to Jesus. How did he do it? We're going to learn what I talk about in my book called The Art of the Parable is. Jesus set the standard we need to follow. Here's how he talked to people. Here's why he spoke to people in that way. And here's why we need to do the same. And this is going to help us reach people. And if it doesn't, be comforted to know this one thing. As you probably already know, Jesus didn't get through to everybody. Neither will you. That's hard for somebody like me, and I'm sure like your pastor, who worked very hard to craft lectures and sermons and to make everything just sizz and pop, and then somebody just falls flat. Well, you know what? Jesus didn't get through to everybody either. So we should remind ourselves humbly of that. And he was God himself in the flesh. So makes me feel a lot better. Here's imaginative apologetics. All right. I'm going to leave the session tonight on a dramatic point on the Incarnation, and I just want to leave you with one last thing, but this can wait. So I'd like to maybe just see if there's a way to start talking about questions, and it might be something I bring up. I don't need to go through this whole slide. There's just a few things, but I wanted to finish here as a segue for next week. So whether I do it after some questions or now, I really don't care. But this is going to bring it to the center, to Jesus. And we're going to start talking about how we can speak to people, how we can appeal to imagination. There's some homework you guys can do if you want to get into some terms that I've obviously just not had enough time to talk about tonight. And we can open next week with some questions. And next week is going to hopefully be a lot more trade, where we can discuss some things and talk about strategies. Tonight was meant to be informative. But I am just about ready to let go here. This is my last subject for tonight, and I wanted it to be a good one, and obviously about Christ. So can we see? I don't see anything in the chat, and I'm just conscious of talking too close to 8:30, so I don't know. Where are we right now with questions?
Well, Michael, thank you. And again, if you have this last slide that you'd like to get through, we've allotted until 8:30.
That's okay. All right.
So you feel free to do that. I know I have at least one question I'd like to ask before we end, but I obviously want to give you the time to finish there as well.
Okay, that's fine. I won't take the whole time. So let me get right to it then, and then let's launch into those questions and have a dialogue. I'd love it. And next week, again, if you follow the class, you're trying to get the most out of it. If you follow the worksheet, there's some directions for session 1 to look at the PowerPoint. Remember, I've left my email for you. You can get it from Pastor and do some of the terms that I skipped over and some of the philosophy stuff. And we can talk about that next week as we start to talk about strategies. But my last real informational thing that I think is very important, and this will talk at least about one of the terms that I skipped over, myth. Okay, we hear a lot of talk about this, and I'm going to get to that at the end. So let me focus on Jesus right now. And of course, that's the most important thing. So let me get there we go. I don't think any of us really need a lesson on what the incarnation is, but just in case, this is that old Latin word incarnem to mean that God has become flesh. One of my favorite scriptures for this, where Paul spells it out pretty clearly, is Colossians 1:15. He is the image of the invisible God, of course, referring to Jesus. I've got a quote here from a scholar, Benson Fraser. He not only talks about the incarnation, but he says the incarnation is the greatest expression of what we call indirect communication. And I've been kind of building up to this. How can we reach people better? How can we appeal to the imagination? Well, to help us answer that question, we look to Jesus first. Jesus is a lot of things, but he's chiefly, very simply and very profoundly and very mysteriously, he's God become flesh. Well, think about that for a moment. See what I did there again? You imagine that for a moment. You're being tasked with picturing an invisible, profoundly powerful, eternal being become a baby. You think you have to use your imagination doing that? You bet. And yet, believe it, it happened. And yet, who could imagine that this would have happened? God could have just shown up and said, hey, what's up? I'm here. Bam, bam, bam. He didn't. Think about how Jesus spoke. We're getting closer to the mystery here. Jesus said nothing to them except in parables. Gospel of Mark tells us in chapter 4 and elsewhere. He spoke to them in parables all the time. Why did he do that? There's a lot of answers you'll get, but the profoundest, I think, is that he spoke in parables because he was God's parable. This is something I get into, the mystery in my book. And Tolkien has this obscure quote to one of his sons in a letter. He says, man would need to be redeemed in a manner consonant with his nature through a moving story. He's talking about the gospel, but he's also talking about Jesus. God wrote himself into his story, but he did this in a kind of way that hides and reveals himself simultaneously. Think about that. God loves to hide in the Bible, and yet he also loves to show up. And he says, if you seek me with all your heart in Jeremiah, I think 29, you'll find me, but you've got to seek me. You got to really want me. But God loves to hide. And the incarnation is indirect communication. We don't expect God to be a man, Benson Fraser says. Like the incarnation, the indirect communication approach hides or veils meaning in order to reveal the actual nature and depth of truth. And there's this moment in, we don't even have to get into that, but there's this moment in the Gospel of Mark when he's telling the parable of the sower in chapter 4. And he says, you guys don't understand this parable. You're not going to understand any of my parables. And you're just not going to get it. This is the gateway. This is the key to understanding everything else I'm going to say. It's the key to understanding me. And if you don't get this, you're not going to get anything else I say. And I'm going to have to explain this annoyingly. And you know, Jesus, he got irritated with his students at every step. And he often did. He parsed it out. Okay, this equals that. And he didn't want to do that. I get the sense he wanted to leave it as a story. And yet people needed to understand. So think about how, here's a profound point, Dr. Holly Ordway, she says, think about how this could shape your apologetic. The incarnation should shape not just what you say, but how you say it. Think about that. The incarnation is the model for what you say, but how you say it. So in guiding us in what to say, it should guide us to appeal to the imagination using images, story, myth. Myth is story. It's that which appeals to the imagination, and myths are true. All of Jesus's parables are true on a very profound level. I don't need to tell you that, but yet they're fictional stories. So that's profound, right? We have to model our apologetic in that way. We have to appeal to the imagination. We also have to appeal to reason, because at the end of the day, we need to know, is Christianity true? And that's reason's job. But it can't do that work without the imagination. Now, in how we should say it, this is another guy, the incarnation. God became a human. He condescended to become like one of us. He didn't think himself too great. I think of Philippians 2 here. He became like a slave, even getting crucified, making a mockery of himself for our sake. how should we conduct ourselves based on that? That's the how part. How to humbly, walking very softly with God, and very humbly, and making sure that our message is crafted in a very careful and profound way as we can. So there's all sorts of implications I want you to think about. The incarnation is indirect communication. Jesus spoke indirectly all the time. 1/3 of the Gospels are parables. That should tell us something. Well, guess what? We should too. Parables are imaginative stories. The incarnation itself is God's genius idea. It's based on using your imagination. And it's not this useless thing. It's a very profound point. And so I'm going to leave you with that, because the more I keep talking about it, the more it's going to ruin it for you. If you can just meditate on that and reflect on that in a biblical way of meditation is what I mean, of course, I think you'll like a hard candy, you'll get a lot of worth out of it if you just take your time with it. All right, so that's that. And I've got some examples from the Lord of the Rings. We can do this next week. So I'm looking forward to talking with you now, and then next week talking about some practical, some really fun stuff I have designed for you. I hope you'll enjoy. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks so much. I'm trying to figure out where the camera is. It's over here. But I know, just as one thing that you said is profound to me, and maybe it stuck with somebody else, talking about a disenchanted world at the moment, and that in order for something to make sense, it must have meaning first. Mm-hmm. And do you have any, just ideas? Our personal stories, or bringing other stories, whether it be a Tolkien, a Lewis, just other narratives that we find helpful, is using narrative like that a way to infuse meaning? Like, as far as to say, is it helpful to explain the meaning like Jesus did in the parable, or is it, in your estimation, is it simply say, hey, I read a story about this one time, and it made me think of this? Or I'm not sure, like, any tips about as far as how to infuse meaning, maybe through narrative?
I do. Great question. I have lots of material that addresses questions like this next week. I promise. So I hope you guys can make it next week as well. But in addition, let me just start to answer it. One example I just recently read today, Holly Ordway, in fact, talks about her own story. She was an atheist. She became a theist and then a Christian. And she says that, she talked to a lot of atheists who just saw God as a sky daddy, a father in the sky, and no better than Zeus. And so she realized that as she was making the transition to Christianity, that her term God, when she used God in a sentence, didn't mean what it meant to her audience. And so she really had to work very hard to tell stories and appeal to the imagination of her audience, to try to recast this very familiar, often overused term in a way that her audience would understand it in a new way. So sharing testimony is important, but I think more than that, it's finding a way to sneak past the watchful dragons of that person's mind. It's finding a way to tell story. I think one of the greatest tips, and I promise I'm going to go over this next week, is to be a person who has read fiction. I can't tell you, reading fiction changes your brain. Neurologists tell us it changes your brain. It will help you, be able to tell story better, and to be able to reach people in an imaginative and an indirect way. So there is all sorts of ways we can create meaning for somebody and take jargon that we use in church, which is jargon to an outsider, and make it comprehensible to somebody who really just has no idea or is hardened to it. So yes, we're going to talk strategies galore next week, I promise.
Well, I want to make sure if anybody does have a question, I want to make sure I allow them to ask. So, Amy, right? There you go.
Jennifer and Kathleen also have their hands still up on Zoom, but
I'll make it quick. My husband's on his way. Thank you, Mike, so much. This is fascinating.
Thank you.
I just had a question about, given our natural fallen state, and not those of us who are saved, but say the reprobate, do you believe that everyone, without exception, longs for truth, goodness, and beauty? Because anyway, yeah.
Well, that's a great question. Yes, and I hope we can get into this in more detail next week, because this gets into the subject of being made in God's image, what that means, what it means for a Christian, what it means for a reprobate, somebody outside the faith, what it means for people born before Christ, the relationship between Christianity and other faiths. But put simply, I would say that Paul gives this answer in Acts 17. He points to pagan imagery in Athens, statues, and he quotes pagan poets to a pagan audience. And he says, your poets and your artists had truth almost right. Not just, not fully right. Obviously, they didn't know Christ, but they got, and I'm just kind of using metaphor here, but they got halfway. They were they're going in the right direction. But here, I'm here to tell you the story that's going to complete that. And so, yes, I think that Paul alludes to the fact that he says, in him we move and have our being. And he's quoting one of the pagan poets who wrote something to this extent. He's not very far from us. So he's seeming to confirm that a biblical perspective would lead us to conclude that, yes, all people, regardless of their fallen state or being within the promises of Christ or outside, would have these longings. But I will say, the imagination can be used for evil purposes. It can be used to deceive. It can be used to mislead. And it can be used to picture the wrong kinds of things, falsehoods. And it can often be seen in, I would say, Aztec mythology, where there are some glimmers of the gospel there, which is why the Spanish were able to make inways the way they were. But there were some terrible demonic corruptions of the truth there as well, but imaginatively so. So that's a great example of where the imagination can be used for terrible, terrible effect. And Lewis and Tolkien were very aware of this. So it's not like, the imagination is the greatest thing. It cuts both ways, if you know what I mean. So.
Thank you so much. I look forward to next week.
Me too. Thanks. Great question.
Another one. Hold on.
Great lecture. My name's Chris Johnson, and I read Tolkien when I was younger, before I became a Christian as an adult. So is there a good companion book when I decide to reread the Lord of the Rings that you would recommend, maybe to read before or after my next?
Yeah,
genre?
I would say thank you, Chris. Yeah, my book is good for it in addressing some of the themes of the Lord of the Rings, especially of kingship and the gospel. But it's not a comprehensive guide. To give you an even better book that does this and not just looking through a Christian lens, I'm looking. Hold on one second. It's on Amazon here. Hammond and Skull, I think it is. The authors. There is literally a Tolkien companion. I didn't have it on my sources slide. Yeah, okay, here it is. Let me see if I can share my screen for a moment. Yeah, and I would, this is a great thing too, if you want to learn kind of like those things, like for example, Aragorn or Strider was originally a hobbit. You'll learn things like that. But Wayne G. Hammond and Christina Skull, only for the Lord of the Rings, but a reader's companion is a great guide. It's kind of like the official guide that most people use. It's not wholly Christian, but I mean, it has a lot in there from his Catholic influences, obviously. So this is a great resource. There is a guide, Corey Olson for The Hobbit. The Silmarillion, I have a chapter on the Silmarillion that deals with a lot of the creation myth, for example. So my book is a great resource, but it's specific. It was written for a kind of a specific purpose I've alluded to. But this one, if you're interested in getting into The Hobbit, is by Corey Olson. This is also a good guide. So those are the two that just jumped right off the top of my head there. I hope you find that helpful.
Anybody else? Any other questions, follow up? And again, Michael's available via email as well. So if you have anything coming to mind as far as anything concerning tonight.
And again, it's mjachoski@gmail.com. I'll put it in the chat as well. You just send me an email if you know.
Yeah, I know we had a couple people online. I want to make sure I give them an opportunity to, I saw Jen and Skip and Kathleen, if they had any questions that they would want to ask, I want to make sure I give that, because I can't quite see them.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Jen.
I am muted. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I've so enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And the truth, goodness, and beauty, that just reminded me so much of C.S. Lewis's Weight of Glory.
Yes. Yes.
Every time I read that, I cry, because he just so articulates that longing that we feel. That for me has been the greatest apologetic.
Me too.
identifying with that longing.
Hmm.
I'm going to talk for a minute, then ask my question.
Okay.
I feel like, because I'm a history teacher myself, the Enlightenment did so much to our current state of things. And it's almost hard to like, I don't know how to solve the problem that the Enlightenment created, especially even for the church. Part of me wants to like try and imagine, could we reimagine like the pre-Enlightenment world? And I don't think we can, but I loved your answer of, well, let's just try and read good stories that will help shape that. So I'm just interested if you could next week or help point us to some other stories too, because I love Tolkien, I love Lewis, and I've even read some of the things that like George MacDonald that Lewis has read, but now even as I have children, I'm trying to find things for them to read. And
I've got plenty.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I think that'd be so helpful because it's such a big thing to get your mind around, but I think that's a great starting place.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a great question, and I planned a very practical session for next week. And one of my, I came up with this kind of, it's not very original, but 12 steps of being a mythic thinker. And one of them is read more stories, read more metaphor, read more poetry. I've got loads of examples. Some of them are not explicitly Christian. Just to give you a foretaste, one that gives me an alternative. One scholar's kind of put it like the haunting alternative to Christianity, the darkened world of postmodernism, you might even say, is the Witcher books, that are so bleak and so dark, and really offer no hope. It's very Nietzschean, will to power, very, even existentialism, which is kind of an offshoot of postmodernism or forefather of it anyway. It's a good book to read to kind of say, here's what a world without Christ in 1,000 places looks like. And doing that helps us to be in touch with how badly we need the gospel. But yeah, I have tons of others. Like most recently, we've been reading the Wingfeather Saga books to my kids.
Yes.
Those are good ones.
My kids have read those.
Cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I will.
I have one more question. Do you think
Sure.
as a church too, trying to, well, and even maybe you can point to, like the Middle Ages, the legends and stories of that time, because that was a time when Europe was at least identified as Christian or thought in that kind of framework. I think that the Enlightenment caused us to reject all of that period.
Right, you are. And I will say that Michael Ward's book, Planet Narnia, did loads for my imagination to say we need to look at the world medievally again and to understand the seven heavens worldview, which I could go into next week if you want, and looking at the Narnia books through those lenses and to just recover that imaginative way of looking at the world again. Pre-Enlightenment, as you said, is very hard to do, but yeah, we can do a lot by pointing back to medieval literature. I mean, I certainly think even Beowulf is a great example, being that it was authored most likely by a Christian, as far as we can tell, Christian Anglo-Saxon author. I mean, he might be one of the best ones to read. The Song of Roland. Yeah, I can, as a student of history, give you examples next week. I will definitely do it. And think medievally almost kind of sounds in a way threatening, or, I'm going to go medieval on you. It doesn't sound too good, but it is good. It is good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Last chance for anybody. Again, email is always open until next week. Want to again plug Michael's book, which I have a copy of here. And thanks to Jen Johnson, who just spoke. She gifted this to me as a wonderful gift. But so if you would like to take a look through that, maybe, and I encourage you to purchase it yourself as a way to, again, stimulate the imagination, particularly when it comes to the issue of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. Well, anyways, I want to say thank you, Michael, for taking your evening, for joining us and blessing us with that lecture. And we look forward to next week, some practical tips on how to reach people for faith in an imaginative way.
Yes. Thank you.
So
thank you so much.
And we look forward to next week.
Okay, me too.
Okay, see you.
Okay, bye guys. See you then.